We're here. Thank you for coming out. This is our second annual event, really doing this, where instead of just inducting the Hall of Fame and never hearing from them again, we come back around and we have a discussion with them. And last year we picked from all different eras. This year, everybody sitting before you is our Long Island Journalism Hall of Fame class of 2022. So my name is Brendan O'Reilly. I'm the president of the Press Club of Long Island. I also am the deputy managing editor of the Express News Group on the South Fork. And Press Club of Long Island is a chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. It's over 100 years old. Our chapter is actually turning 50 in 2024, so we're going to celebrate coming soon. Our chapter was actually founded as an independent club in response to a journalist being unfairly jailed. So we're going to share a lot more of that history as we unveil our 50th anniversary celebration in the coming 18 months or so. So I won't go into that tonight. But after a couple years as an independent club, we became affiliated with SPJ. It is an organization that is across the spectrum, whereas a lot of organizations are just for broadcasters, just for print, just for online. We do a little bit of everything. We recently had our national convention in Washington, D.C. Woodward and Bernstein were among our keynote speakers. And next year, the SPJ convention is in Las Vegas. So if you've never been to Vegas, here's your chance. If you are a journalist or an aspiring journalist who is not yet a member of Press Club of Long Island, I encourage you to join. We actually don't charge anything to join. The only thing we require is that you join SPJ first, $75 a year for a pro, half that price for a student or retired. When you are a member of SPJ, you get our free media guide, which is a directory of all the Long Island media every year, complimentary. You get a free entry into our annual awards. Our awards for 2023 is going to open up for entries in January. We're generally open for entries from January through March. And then in June, we throw our big awards dinner / Hall of Fame induction. If there is anybody who is not in the Hall of Fame who you think deserves to be, you can write a letter to me or to the secretary of PCLI. We take nominations year-round. We consider them once a year. So we really love to hear from everybody, not just board members who they think deserves to be in the Long Island Hall of Fame. Maybe there's some people you know about who aren't on our radar who have made significant contributions to Long Island, or maybe they're a Long Islander who made significant contributions to journalism in general. So I want to introduce to you our moderator for the evening, and I'll let him introduce the rest of the panel. So Chris Vaccaro is a Hofstra University alumnus. He is the Vice President of Digital for Altice USA News, and he is the Director of Graduate Journalism at Hofstra University. He is a past president and current board member of the Press Club of Long Island, and he is the SPJ Region 1 Director. So Chris is going to do double duty tonight because not only is he in the class of 2002, he's also going to moderate this evening. So Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, I won't answer any questions that I asked the group. I'll work my own feedback in, but no, I really honored to be just with these people. I always say that I think, I believe in things that are bigger than myself, and I think the Press Club is, I think SPJ is, journalism is, and the fact that we could be here tonight to talk about those things, which I know mean a lot to this group, which covers decades of experience in TV and print, narrative, and so many different members of a hungry audience that they serve every day, which is the most important thing, to provide news and information for people that need it. So we'll hear about their journeys, and we'll talk about their take on the industry. It's being recorded for posterity, but also for the students who didn't come, who should inevitably fail the graduate program for not being here to support all of us. But no, we want to make sure that we touch on your lives and your careers. And so we have Joye Brown from Newsday, longtime Newsday reporter who's told so many impactful stories. We're happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
And Bryan Boyhan with the Express News Group, publisher, editor, East End representative. We don't have enough of those in a lot that we do.
Yeah.
And thanks to Brendan O'Reilly, who also works on the East End with the Express News Group. There's a push to have that emphasis from East End storytelling. Joe Shaw is here tonight, and it's important that we have that representation in our Hall of Fame. So Bryan Boyhan. And Drew Scott, I mean, everybody knows Drew Scott from television, from News 12, even on radio, obviously, with LI News Radio. He's doing a bit with Newsday now. He's on TV in Vermont. He's all over the whole Northeast broadcast landscape. So telling stories on your television for 30, 40 years is pretty special. So Drew Scott. I always like to treat these kind of very linear in a sense of starting in the beginning of, yeah, we're focusing on the big stories that you told and longevity in the industry to get to those impactful stories that people have been touched by. But something had to inspire you guys to go into journalism. And I always like to ask, what was it? Was it a story? Was it a moment in time? Was it high school? Was it something where you didn't even feel comfortable until your first job? But I'll start with Joy. What was the impactful moment? When did you say, this is for me and I want to do this forever?
Actually, there are 2 points in time. The second point was when I was a junior in college, and I decided I really didn't want to be a doctor. I wanted to be a reporter. But long before then, I had actually worked on my high school newspaper and was editor of my high school paper. And I ended up being the editor of my college newspaper. And I guess one of the more well, first off, I went to school in Washington, D.C., right? Woodward and Bernstein, right? Although I didn't want to meet him when our high school newspaper took us to the Washington Post office, but that's a different story. And probably one of the more interesting things is I went to an all-girls Catholic school. And these days, with the overturning of Roe, people keep wearing these t-shirts and they say 1973, right? 1973. I was in high school in 1973. I was on the high school newspaper called The Dome in an all-girls Catholic school where our advisor was an editor for the Washington Post, and we did a special edition on abortion, which, looking back on it now, I marvel. How did we pull that one off? We were dispatched to family planning clinics. We went everywhere. All of us on the staff, and we put together a really good special edition on what was happening in terms of the conversation, the fight, because remember, at Washington, every day people were screaming and yelling at each other, marching in the streets. What was happening there? What was happening there? I think we did that in '72, which was a year before the Supreme Court decision came down. But as part of that, we actually went out to protest. We talked to women. We even had an interview with one of our classmates who had had an abortion. We granted her anonymity, of course. But you look at that and you see that you can walk into something that everybody's talking about, and you could make it something that was understandable and relatable and important to the girls at the Academy of Notre Dame at North Cabell and K Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. That's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Brian?
Well, I think I first fell in love with the notion of newspapering, not specifically being a journalist. I had a friend of mine who I lived with in Bayport and who owned a paper on Fire Island, the Fire Island Tide, and used to make the paper up on our dining room table. And I watched the process, putting it together every 2 weeks, and watching them put this, figure out what stories are going in, how you play the front page, and I wound up doing a couple of stories for him over the years. I was telling Joe Shaw on the way in, I actually interviewed Andy Warhol because I ran into him into a bar on Fire Island. But I never really got into journalism as a career. I taught for a while. I taught in Brentwood, high school English for a while, and moved out east. And I didn't get into the business at all until I kind of fell into it. I was in between jobs, as they say, and I ran into my friend and another friend who owned, at the time, he owned the Three Village Herald up in Setauket, and he had just bought a newspaper in Sag Harbor. And I discovered they were looking for an editor, and I could write, and probably more of an indication as to the real dearth in talent there was in Sag Harbor. They hired me, and I fell in love with the notion of, again, putting together a weekly package of news and information. And as I learned more and more about it, I learned the importance of being able to help people understand what's going around in their community. Now, the Express was a very small community. I think we had a circulation of probably about 2,000, and in a community, a village that had a population of about 2,500. So it was a very small town stuff. And I learned over the years how special that is, being able to have that size of a community that you could really keep informed and help them understand what was going on in their community. And that's how I really began to develop a passion for journalism.
Well, I have not always been a Long Islander. I arrived in Long Island in 1970, and I grew up in a media town. And as a kid in high school, before high school, I used to, instead of running down to the beach and going surfing with my pals, I used to sneak in the back door of the radio station in my hometown, which is Hollywood, California. And it's a media town, and I found it fascinating. And Averill Berman was the news director at that time. Interesting guy. He was very well known in that town, and I volunteered to be his intern for no pay in the 6th grade, and so he taught me how to edit wire copy right off the teletype, how to change the ribbon, how to maintain the newsroom, and it was definitely a rip and read operation. It was KDAY, K-Day, and I just found it fascinating. So when I got to school, I definitely enrolled in the journalism courses in journalism school, and I found I just knew this is what I wanted to do from 6th grade, I guess, 5th grade. I always say to students, if you get an opportunity to get in the front door, or if you can't, go in the back door, but get in and make yourself available, and that's how you learn. Even if you do it for no pay for a certain period of time, you're going to learn a lot.
Great. And I'll only answer this question because Rich is here. So Rich went to Sachem High School like me. I had an English teacher that saw something in me from an English assignment that I had done, said, you should go work for the school paper. I did, and at 14, I knew exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Fast forward 2 years to when I'm 16, past the cafeteria at Sachem North, there's it's kind of like a promotional ad of what Sachem could provide in terms of its student body. And on that placard is Rich Samini, who has been a Jets beat writer for 30 plus years, Daily News, probably a Newsday at the time when that thing was made, ESPN for many years now. And I would look at that, I didn't know Rich at the time, but I would say, that's a young Italian-American guy that's doing sports journalism. I'm in the right track, I'm in the right building, I'm in the right community, and I've always used that to fuel where I wanted to get. And I actually wound up being an editor at the Daily News at one point, and Rich was there for many years. So yeah, I would have not editorialized, and Rich has heard me say that before, but since he's here, I'm pleasantly surprised to see him. He represents us in our Sachem community as finest as anybody in journalism. So, and then I went here, and the fuel was as strong as ever and propelled me to pretty cool things. And so we started at the beginning, and I'm gonna flip to the end of kind of impactful storytelling for all of you. Too many stories to think of and to count on two hands, let alone 30, 40 years of experience. But if you're looking back at a Hall of Fame career, what was the impactful story that meant the most to you, or made the biggest impact on society? Is there one, two, a couple of things that you could say, yeah, that could be my legacy as a storyteller? Let's start with Joy again.
Oh, well, gee, I should have sat in the middle.
Yeah.
Let me see. That's a good story. I mean, that's an interesting.
It's a good story.
Well, Nassau University Medical Center is open because I worked really hard when Tom Galata wanted to sell it off and shut it down, to get something in there, to make certain that the county always would have an interest in it. Now, little did I know that 20 years later, it would mean that if the hospital went down, the county would have a problem because it's guaranteeing its bonds. But that was it. They configured that part. But no, at one point in time, there really was a plan afoot to shut that place down. The other thing was, and I guess you can hurt me for this one if you want to, is that I'm responsible for NIFA. Back in the 1980s, Nassau County was in very, very bad financial condition, but nobody knew it because they would always say things like, you know, we have this surplus. And you know, our deficit is, I'm making this up, our deficit is $1. They weren't counting the deficits that they said were capital. The way they were doing it in a funny way. I mean, they were going down the tubes big time, to the point where, I don't know if you remember this, but they became 1 point short of insolvent, which didn't make any sense. And what I remember about that is I'm looking at the numbers, I like numbers, and I go to my boss and I'm saying, look, I'm looking at this thing. Then I call Carl McCall, and I'm like, dude, am I crazy? He's the former state comptroller. He's like, no, we sent them letters telling them about this. Well, can I see those letters? Sure. You show them the letters, and then you talk to the bond rating agencies, and then you take another look at the budget. And I went to my boss and I said, this county's going down the tubes financially. And he said, write me a memo. And I wrote him a memo. And the next thing I know, I am in the city with Governor Pataki and with who was the first NIFA chair? Do you remember? Frank, you have a school named after him.
Frank Czar.
Czar.
Czar, that's it.
It's me. I've never seen Frank Czar a day in my life. It's the governor, it's my boss, and it's Newsday publisher. And Pataki says, we looked at this, it's absolutely correct. This is what we propose, a carrot and a stick, yada, yada, yada. They go through the whole thing. And then the publisher looks over at the governor looks at the publisher of Newsday and says, does that work for you? Is that gonna work? And the publisher said, actually, you talked to the wrong person. You gotta talk to Joy. And so Pataki turns to me and I ask a couple of questions. I'm like, well, you know, that might work, you know, if it's short term. And of course, 21 years later, it's not short term. So I think that any kind of story, and there are a lot of different stories where you have a direct impact on changing policy or people, or making sure that things that were supposed to happen that were bad don't happen, or things that weren't happening that were good happen. I think that's the hallmark, I think, of a good career.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of us have, especially if you've been around as long as some of us have told a lot of great stories in our time. I think probably, and again, I come from a small town, but it had a large industrial past. Sag Harbor started out had a whaling history, and then a long period of depression, and then they began to attract factories and manufacturing. And the result of that is all of the bad things that happen with industries and communities. And we have, I would argue, probably more Superfund sites per square foot than just about any town on Long Island. There was one particular case, you know, in my time, they've discovered a number of different Superfund sites, and you know, because development gets proposed and they begin testing and they find these. One project in particular was Rowe Industries. Rowe Plastics, you may be familiar with them. They're a manufacturer of molded plastics. And they used to make little electric engines, and they would have degreasers that cleaned all of the tools that they used. And back in the day, they really didn't pay attention to how those solvents were disposed, and a lot of it went into the groundwater. They actually had a fire at the plant back in the 60s, and they just literally plowed it. They would have these 55-gallon drums of spent degreasers into the soil it went, and then not further along into the groundwater. The state began to negotiate with Nabisco, which now had bought Rowe Industries, and they were just trying to solve the problem as quickly as possible. What we learned was that the plan that they were proposing would have arguably done more damage to the environment downstream. And we wrote a series of articles that really brought to light, and the public began to understand it. This goes back to the idea about trying to keep your public informed about what's going on in their neighborhood. We brought to light the damage that this plan would have done, and through pressure from what we did and what the community did, we got them to change their plan and really protect a lot of the downstream environment. That was probably the most important, I think, from a public interest standpoint.
Yeah, I think the AIDS crisis was one particular story that I remember. A young mother was in the process of dying, and she had a daughter, and she owned a house, and she had a mortgage. And I was at Channel 11, and Channel 11 had a lot of clout with their consumer stories. So the one thing is that she, in her dying, she wanted to pass this mortgage to her daughter, or this house to her daughter, and instead of losing the house. So we did a story on that, and fortunately the pressure was brought on the bank to hand over the house to the daughter, and she inherited the house mortgage free, which was a great coup for us at Channel 11. And I think telling a story at 9/11, after 9/11, seeing we had these informational boards on most every block down on Canal Street and further south, and people didn't know where their loved ones were. So the only thing they could do was go and look for these information boards and see posted, have you seen my husband? Have you seen my daughter? Have you seen my son? And it was a heart-wrenching story. And so we did the story night after night after night, and that brought pressure, I think, to get the steamroller going and establishing a 9/11 museum. That was something that I can remember. I think it's probably the one that really made an impression on me, telling that story every night. It was a tough one, very tough.
I forgot to open with the reason why we're actually at Hofstra. The building next door, the Herbert School of Communication, has the actual Hall of Fame plaque listing of all the names in the Hall of Fame. So if you want to go check it out after, we can. We're in this building because the studio over there is impossible to get space and time. There's so many student productions going on. When I think about media, ever since I'm 14 up, it's transformation comes to thought. It's just constantly evolving. The way stories are being told, it really doesn't matter if it's the 50s or if it's 2022. It seems like media has always been transforming, and storytellers have to be flexible and agile. And I'm curious to see, how you've evolved in your careers. Where do you think the biggest change was? Was it writing ability? Was it understanding social media? Was it adapting to working with web or broadcast? Is it a combination of all of that? But where did you see yourselves being moldable? Obviously, to stay in the places you've been for so long, you had to be adaptive to the environment, but also to the audience and their expectations. Where would you say, those points of change were for you, and how did you adapt? So again,
You want to start on that side?
I'll start with Drew.
There.
Let's go back. We just heard from Drew, but we'll go.
Yeah, we love Drew.
Probably the adaptation of social media. Nobody knew how important it would become, but it just suddenly arrived one year, and I remember sitting around talking about Cyber Monday, and I guess we were in a group discussion, and Pat Dolan was the owner of News 12 at the time. He wanted to really make the entire newsroom electronic, so we organized a training facility, and we got computers, and we got everybody trained. And one of the things that our instructor told us is there's this new website that's something that is going to be a great tool for you in the future. It's called Google. This was 1998 or 99, right around there, just before Y2K. And man, if I had just invested in some stock, it would have been a great thing. But that was probably learning to adapt with social media, using that as a tool to get a wider audience, to get people to volunteer stories, and to take a temperature of the audience was a great tool, and it still is, and it's certainly widened out. So I would say probably that's one thing. The other adaptation is learning to edit as you go. And most of us started, a lot of us started in film, and we cut film, and when I started a crew to go out and tell a story, it was a 4-person crew. It was a camera person, a sound person, a light electrician, and me. It was a 4-person crew, and now most MMJs go by themselves and tell a story and shoot the video and do the editing and cut the story and put it on the air. So that is a huge adaptation that has taken place over the past 30 years.
I think probably for me, the biggest evolution, the biggest change was I came into the business without a lot of experience. And for me, it was a lot of on-the-job training. And one area of the business that and I still believe it's a very important part to get people more involved with the newspapers, print. I'm a big believer in print is not dead, but was probably design and makeup. And I think some of the things that I started to do with the Express was change how the paper looked and how it functioned. And the more and more I learned about readers, how they consume news, how best to get them engaged in the product, I tried to institute more interesting graphics, certainly, but more interesting packages, and to start thinking about how newspapers themselves can evolve as a print product. One of the things that Joe and I were involved in with the New York Press Association, both he and I served on the board. I was president of the New York Press Association for a couple of years, and we started a project called Community 360. And I think probably in my time in newspapering, it was, while it was a bear to kind of get off the ground and try to convince people, it was trying to force editors to rethink how they covered their communities. We tend to, those of us in the community newspaper business, tend to think in very narrow channels. We think of government, we think of education, breaking news, sports, and what we tried to do with Community 360 was ask our editors to reimagine how they, what types of news that they included in the newspaper, how they packaged it, and how they presented it. Everything from consumer information. You know, there used to be, when I was a kid growing up, you had the women's pages. What was known as not to be sexist, but you had what in the trade were called the women's pages. And it was everything from food to, consumer information, fashion, and that kind of thing. There is what I think that we did in the print industry for many years was, especially in the weekly newspaper, you found things that you could easily manage. Joe went to cover the zoning board, and Mary went to cover the school board, and that was how news got covered. And we tried to get editors to think differently about the kind of content that they wanted to include in newspapers. And then what I tried to do was really try to figure out how to package it in more interesting, more digestible, and more compelling ways. I think that's probably the biggest evolution that I had in the business.
And I still think people are trying to evolve like that today.
Yeah.
Because they're always trying to figure out how to cover something else. The data suggests more local or more consumer or more health and fitness.
That's correct.
It's every single day.
So if you ask yourself, well, how do you spend your day? Do you spend your day worrying about the curb cut at the gas station that they're, or zoning variances? No, you don't. You think about, well, what am I going to have for dinner? Where are we going to get? Where can I go on a hike? You know, and I think of recreational stuff and how people bring. People are seeking more than just news about their government. God knows that's an important mission that we have, and arguably the most important mission is to keep our elected officials honest. But there is more to life in your community than that. And I believe the newspaper, community newspaper's obligation is to address those aspects of community life as well.
Joy, how about your evolution?
My evolution? First off, you have to understand that I'm a techie and a nerd. I don't like to be bored, and I'm curious about everything. And I think this is the perfect profession for somebody like me. I learned how to write traditional pyramid style in high school. My mentors were editors and reporters at the Washington Post. My first journalism classes were at Catholic University, again, editors and reporters at the Washington Post. Who didn't think of anything of telling you when you were wrong. But my first real job actually was in radio. I wrote and worked for a radio network, Mutual Broadcasting. You know, every 15 minutes, dun, 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 dun. Which meant that you had to learn not just how to write, and you know, on your machines now when you're editing audio, there's a picture of a razor blade. Well, I actually had the razor blade and some tape. The other part about that was you had to learn how to talk to people. And you had to get people to talk to you in something that was clear and short enough to be put in a broadcast. So if that meant you had to ask questions the right way, or ask them 15 times, or ask them a different way. I had to get over my shyness because you had to run in someplace with a, remember alligator clips? Am I the only person? You know alligator clips. You had to run in someplace, you had to interview somebody, get back, take the phone apart, put the alligator clips in, and send all that stuff in. So it taught you to be fast, it taught you to get clear. I mean, Senator Humphreys is dying. So I had to call around and get people to talk about what a great man he was, although he was still alive. Get off shift, get to the airport, get on a plane, North Carolina, the cab's there. He turns on, of course, it's Mutual Broadcasting, and what's it? Hubert Humphrey's dead, and they play something that I had just gotten an hour before, 2 hours before, and unfortunately I started laughing. The poor man, I think he wanted to kill me, but he had to be there. It's like one of those things. The other thing I think that helped me is I grew up in Washington, D.C. You gotta remember, no state, no county, no city. We didn't have a city council till the 70s. No local court system. My dad and Judge John J. Sirica of Watergate fame worked in the same little courthouse, because again, DC had there's nothing there. So I had to learn about all of that stuff. And when I finally got a newspaper job in North Carolina, the rookie, they would send me off to the most boring stuff you ever imagined. And I think that this was the key to my success. Sitting in those hours-long meetings, I came up with my theory of revenge journalism, which was that if I had to sit there all night long in this boring thing, I had to find a story. And it wasn't just gonna be some poded up, messy story. It had to be like really, 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 really good. Something nobody saw coming. So I would interview people. I would read the stuff on the table. I would look at everything I possibly could. And I would go back and write them something that they never saw coming. And I think that probably more than anything, this theory of revenge journalism helped me, because it goes back to what I always tell you, which is be where everyone isn't. As far as the internet is concerned, I used to code my kids' swim team web pages. So that transition was not too difficult for me. You know, I'm the one who's always telling Newsday, you know, TikTok is dead, you gotta go to the next thing. I'm always like one step ahead, because again, this is the kind of stuff I like. Yes, I read Wired. I love this stuff. I love the techie stuff. But all of it is to a single purpose, which is to come up with a way to engage an audience so that they hang with you, you know, word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, you know, interview by interview. If you can do that, and that's the tough part. I think that's something that keeps you going. I think that is the forever in the arc of all of this. You know, the chariot changed, but the stuff you put into it is basically the same. You have to be out there, you have to be talking to people, you have to express a real interest, you have to get them to respond to you. I think the other thing that revenge journalism helped me with is it gave me the ability to talk to people enough so that I could actually see things, hear things, smell things through their eyes, ears, and nose. And that, I think, is the best place for any kind of reporter to be, whether you're in the office or outside the office, because you know what you want from your reporters. If you're an editor, right? And if you're on the street, you know, you want to bring that something special that's going to connect to the audience, not your bosses, although revenge journalism was all about telling my bosses, hey, I can do better than this. But that's what you want to do. You want to always bring something fresh and present it in a fresh way. And finally, I will say the other part of my evolution is bosses that were brave enough to let me do what I wanted to do. And that takes a lot. When I was on the editorial page, the only thing I never did was write an editorial in haiku. But that's about the only thing I never did. As a columnist, I wrote a column, what was it, using music lyrics. I had a Spotify list, I had quizzes, you know, anything I could possibly do to figure out the best way to get what I wanted across, I would go ahead and do it. And they were brave enough to let me do it. Although sometimes they would say, Joy, you've gone too far. And I would rewrite or redo, but the fact that they even let me try it, I think was amazing for me. Absolutely stunningly amazing. So yeah, do be you. Just like you guys. I love what you do.
The group, questions from the audience. You know, we definitely have some time here. It doesn't have to just be me asking things. I'll open it up. Anybody want to ask to the group questions or individuals? Yeah.
James Fedor with Newsday. Each of you has had a very distinguished career, and yet you devoted yourself to covering the story of Long Island, telling the story of Long Island every day. Talk about what it is about Long Island that captivated you and made you decide, you know what, I'm going to tell this island story. I don't need to go to New York City, I don't need to go to Washington, I don't need to go to LA, it's right here. So talk about what you found so exciting about Long Island and why you devoted so much of your life to telling its story.
Why'd you start?
Wow. First of all, I never even moved out of the community that I grew up in. I refused. I lived at home all of the years that I went to Hofstra too. So I adore our surroundings and the ability to tell the stories of our backyard, while that's cliche, really matters to me the most. And that right now it means the most to me, serving in my capacity with News 12 and seeing firsthand the audience that we impact and the stories that we get to tell. And even more specifically, digital, mobile, social, and streaming, which is my area of responsibility. The fact that we're trying to evolve a brand and be on more platforms and touch audiences that are not just on a television or not just on a website means a great deal, because those are my neighbors. They are you. They are people that we don't know by the millions, but it's such a great, powerful responsibility. And so I'm not writing stories every day. I'm not even telling stories every day, but I'm managing the people and the product and the platforms where people get their news. And so my combination of how digital impacts Long Island is vital to how people make decisions. And so that is what empowers me every second. Every second of my day is about how we can do this for each other. And then I really get caught up in, honestly, the history of everything. You know, Bill Blyer is not here, but he is a big mentor and friend of mine. And those types of stories that he wrote for 33 years at Newsday always mattered so much to me, because it helps paint the landscape of who Long Island was and where we're going. And that's important, to connect the dots between the past and present, but also future. And so I just really, I gravitate towards, that historical reference of the storytelling. So that's my take on it.
Well, I don't like living in big, tall buildings, so I kind of like the suburban atmosphere of Long Island. But you've got everything here that New York City has: great restaurants, great ethnic neighborhoods.
8 million people.
8 million people, and everybody's got a great story to tell. So I just have found it as just as refreshing as New York City. So I prefer being here and telling these stories here. But recently I was in Vermont for about 7 months and enjoyed that a lot too. There's one thing I never got working at News 12 or any of the stations in the city that I worked at. Guy calls me up the very first night I'm working, and he says, listen, somebody shot my cow. And I said, did you tell the police? He says, no, I'm telling you guys first. I said, well, I thanked him very much, but call the police first and then get around to telling us. So I said, this will never happen on Long Island or New York City, but it was great.
Both on the side.
Absolutely. But yeah, it's a different kind of storytelling up there, for sure. But it helped me to widen out a little more. So I learned a lot for 7 months in Vermont.
Although remember, the bull got loose here, and that was like the biggest
right,
story
yeah,
of the
yeah.
summer a year ago.
Did they ever figure out if that was a hoax or not, the recent Bohemia Bowl? Like,
Oh, I don't know.
okay.
Probably not. It's too Long Island to be a hoax.
Right.
Because there are no hoaxes on Long Island.
Well,
Oh, absolutely.
I've lived, I think, just about from one end to the other on Long Island. I was a little kid in Lynbrook, and I grew up in Oakdale. I was a young adult in Bayport and Fire Island, and then a family man in East Hampton and Sag Harbor. And it's an interesting question you asked, because the stories of Long Island are like suburbia. It's it borders on being homogenous, but there are, as we have all found, I think, in our careers, there are these unique stories that occur. And suburbia gets kind of a bad rap, understandably, I think, in many cases. But we have, I think, very successfully found those stories in our communities that touch people's lives. I think you could go to anywhere in the country and ask that question, and the response is going to be, well, as journalists, we find stories, whether it's a patently suburban story, or an urban story. And I would say that, the issues in Sag Harbor, certainly 35 years ago when I started there, are similar and different than the stories of Levittown or Lindenhurst. One of the things I find still about Sag Harbor is that it is I want to call it unique, but it's not unique. Sag Harbor is one of those communities where history is very close to the surface. If you look at, again, Lindenhurst or Levittown, not to poke fun at Lindenhurst or Levittown, much of the history of those communities has been plowed under, and the tall buildings that you hate so much have sprung up where the farm fields and so on. For at least the time being, much of that old part of Long Island still exists where I live, and we get to celebrate that. And I think probably many of the most interesting stories that we tell, and I say we, Joe and myself, as editors for papers on the East End of Long Island, are those stories where the conflict between Western Long Island, or as we like to call it, up the island, and Eastern Long Island, and the way the life was out there conflict, and the change, the drum and strung that continues. And I find that this is a real Long Island narrative that we get to tell. And I don't know to what degree that people who live up in Wyandanch or Huntington get to tell those same kinds of stories. So that's the kind of thing that always got my juices going. And I just think that I was blessed. I'm mostly retired now, but I do get to write a kind of an interesting story now and again. I'm at that point in my career where I can kind of pick the stories that I want to write. And most of those stories are about something that is truly a Sag Harbor or an East End fabric kind of a story. So if that answers your question.
All right, here's the deal. I was living in Chicago, got engaged. We flipped a quarter and I lost and I ended up on Long Island. That's God's truth. And he wouldn't go for a second flip. But I'm glad I didn't go. I didn't really like Chicago that much anyway. Born in Washington, why on earth would I want to go work in Washington? A lot of reporters in Washington, they just sort of sit and wait for stuff. I've never been like that. I would never be like that. To me, to be assigned to the White House is death and doom. Assigned to the Capitol, my uncle was a barber there. I've been running all through those halls since I was, a kid. The thing that, and when I first came to Long Island, I was sitting with my best friend, and we were sitting at a restaurant in Huntington. I looked out and I said, look at them. They're dressed alike. It's like the Stepford Wives, right? This is weird. I don't know if I can do this. This is, oh my God, what have I done? But I actually came to Newsday as a minority affairs reporter, which is something they drummed up for me to give me more money, because as I said, I lost that coin flip, so I had to have something for it. The other thing I got was a house near the water, cheapest house near the water. I think it was exploring all of those neighborhoods and communities that we talk about that people don't think about as the Long Island. It's kind of helped me put all of Long Island together. I think of Long Island as a community of communities. And I think that you just don't get a lot of that there. The suburbs around Washington, kind of vanilla-y, not much going on there. This is a really dynamic place where people live in their own communities and you never really know what's going on underneath the surface. You have to go dig it out, right? You gotta dig it out. I'm sorry to say, Joye Brown editor, some of the worst days of my life. I was in charge of that mess. And I got away to Washington. I was in the Giant, and they had the news on, and it was Joey, and I was like, oh, fuck me, in the middle of the whole, I was like, why are you doing this? But I think as an outsider, I had the opportunity to kind of see the island as it is, and also over almost 40 years to see the island as it has evolved. You go out to where you are, where the whalers were. I can go and take a look at all of this stuff. I can also see how Long Island was changed by the GIs returning after World War II. In my head, I call them the settler generation, because they settled in and kind of gave us the face of Long Island as the first post-war, suburb that we see. And then we have this other transformation that's going on right now, all over the place. That people if you see it, you see it, and if you don't see it, you don't see it. I think it's very exciting. The other thing you have to remember is I've never been anywhere professionally or personally in my life where the average person has access to power and has influence so easily. You guys have school boards. You can go to school board meetings, scream, yell, and holler, and they'll do what you want a lot of the time. You guys can go to the library. We didn't have any of this stuff in Washington. You can go stand up and scream at your town councilman. I've had those. So I think that for me, it's this endless fascination with things. You guys are I've never seen anything like this before. And because I've never seen anything like this before, I find it all terribly exciting. I find it fascinating. I am never, ever, ever bored in any community or neighborhood on Long Island, because they're all different and they're all alike and they're all evolving all at the same time. And that makes fruitful opportunity to tell stories.
Awesome. Yeah, we have time for at least one more question. We could probably go a couple, so you raise your hand first.
I'm Sean Lanigan. I'm a recent mass comm broadcast graduate from Five Towns College this past May. And I was very fortunate at Five Towns. I got to do a bunch of different content, writing, radio, and television. And what I wanted to ask was, in those forums, do you enjoy the reporting journalism more, or do you enjoy the more, shows or where you have your opinion, like an editorial or a commentary or a written article? Like, for example, I'm a big sports fan, so I covered a lot of sports at Five Towns. So I did sports reporting, but I also did sports radio shows on our radio station where I was able to express sports opinions and have fun that way. Do you guys find one or the other more fun, more appealing for any of you? Oh, okay.
I've done reporting, editing, and I run the editorial page. When I was on the editorial page, and when I go talk to students, I tell them, what's the first thing you do before you buy a pair of shoes? You go online, and what do you check?
The reviews.
The reviews.
Yeah.
Everybody has an opinion these days, and everybody has access to everybody else's opinion. So what's one more opinion? When I was I'd never wanted to be a columnist, but I had to kind of think these things over when I went in. I don't think anybody cares what a columnist thinks. I thought that my value would come in trying to be contextual, trying to add something to it, trying to tell you something that you might not know, or even better, tell you something that you might not want to hear in a way that made it approachable to you. I think when everybody has an opinion on everything, and everybody has access to it, I think if you're gonna do that kind of opinion stuff, you have to differentiate yourself. And in my view, as a reporter, you want to differentiate yourself either by being authoritative, right? You know what you're talking about, and that means that you worked to figure out what it was that you were going to be talking about. And you got to be somebody who's approachable. I don't believe in, I'm not going to say that because we're recording, but I don't believe in talking down to people. I believe in talking to people. And I think a lot of opinion is talking down or screaming or talking to people who agree with you. The harder thing to do and the more fruitful thing in my view is to be something that's authoritative and something that is going to inform, or at least in my head, there are two people sitting on a stool. I don't need you to get off your stool and come to me. All I need you to do is sit up on your stool and listen. That's it. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What do you guys think?
It's funny, on the way up, I was wondering where this conversation was going to go today. And I think probably the most dangerous thing that's occurring in media right now is the internet. And to your point, everybody's got an opinion. And I think, unfortunately, there is a large population, probably on both sides of the aisle, that listens to that echo chamber, listens to those people who are speaking to them and expressing their opinions. I can't tell you how damaging I find what is going on in social media from the standpoint of us as a democratic country. I'm terrified about what I see on on the news. My politics are, left of center certainly, but my stomach turns when I watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. I get aggravated. I will tell you the moment where where it turned for me, and it was the night of when Trump was elected, and watching CNN and Wolf Blitzer, when the numbers came in, said, "We lost."
Oh, Jesus.
And at that moment, I thought, oh my God. And so this is the kind of thing that I am terrified about. I'm terrified of the people who subscribe to polemic, what passes for journalism on the internet. I just think it's the worst thing since sliced bread. That's my own. I'm not sure if that answers your question at all.
Thank you
but
very
it's
much.
David North.
Yes, hi, Dave North from the Press Club Board. Two of you are also imports to Long Island, and just looking at the landscape here, what surprised me was a community of 3 million people, essentially one daily newspaper and one television station. There's still opportunities to find work within those communities, but among the educators and professional journalists here who speak to young people who want to stay here, who want to serve this community, what's your advice for them to take steps to make a living when there are essentially 2 aggregate journalism sites for 3 million people? Why should they be encouraged to pursue this profession in this location?
All right, so
yeah.
you guys know what news deserts are, right? Say yes or no,
Yes.
right? These are communities that have no papers. You guys know what ghost papers are, yes? Okay, Long Island's blessed not to have any of that. And you talk about 2, but I think we got some hellified weeklies here on Long Island. Hellified weeklies on Long Island. They do a I keep forgetting it. They do a damn good job covering the communities that they're in, and they do it with authority, and they do it contextually. So what would I say to somebody who wants to make a living here? Well, I would say a couple of things. One, you got to figure out a way. All the old ways are gone. I came up through a small newspaper, newspaper, came to New York, came to Newsday. The Times wanted me. That was enough for me. I'll never work there. And then I decided to settle here. I don't think you have to just go for one TV station or for one radio station. I think you make yourself the best that you can, and maybe you have to leave to come back. The other thing, though, is I think that, and this is not what you asked, but I'm gonna go a different way. I think that we, in the TV station and in the newspaper, I think we have to change the way we go about kind of looking for people. I don't like internship programs. Don't get me in trouble. I don't like internship programs anymore, or unpaid internship. What I would like to see is us evolve into training programs that you take young people from Long Island, like from 5 towns. We have a whole TV studio, dude, right? We could probably use engineers in there. I would like to see us take the initiative to
Fellowship programs.
to help young people on Long Island who are interested in going in this business. And I think one way to do that, again, fellowship programs or training programs that lead to employment, things like that. So I think it's not just your issue, I think it's more our issue as well.
You lose the young journalists, you lose local journalism.
Well, yeah, we have a journalist over here. You look mighty young.
Yes,
What
I
are you,
am.
40?
Actually,
Sorry, I'm joking.
I am a sophomore here at Hofstra. I'm a journalism major, provided political science, and I'm the news director at WRHU. My question is, along the lines of that, I've often heard journalism as referred to as a service industry. What do you feel about that? How does that make you feel? Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that?
Used to be.
Why don't you tell me what your definition of service industry is?
Basically for me, I think it's our job to essentially inform a community or even teach a community about what is going on with, for example, national news and how it affects at a local level. That's something that we do at WRHU. It's what I train my reporters to do, is to take big news and tell people here why they should care. And so for that reason, when you inform people, the more they know, the more they can do, the more they can prepare. And so that's, for me, that's what I define as the service industry.
And let me ask you something. How well is the service going? How well do you know that it is in fact a service?
Sorry, can you rephrase that?
Let me try this a different way. You know that you provide a service. Do the people you provide the service to, are they listening? Are they hearing? Are they acting on what you're doing?
From what I have heard, it's a mixture of yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on a few different factors. If they like what they hear, if they agree with what they hear, or the fear tactic. If what they hear scares them and they want to see change, then yes.
Well, I think that you just answered the question for us. I think that I can't say we, I don't have worms. What I try to do is try to make something that's interesting and relevant. I don't like to waste my time. I also don't like to waste the consumer's time, right? And the other thing I should tell you is that we didn't talk about any of this. Anybody ever heard the word metrics? Metrics?
Yeah.
We're metriced all over the place. I'm metriced, right? I know what my metrics are. I know what people like and what people don't like about what I do and what I don't do. So in terms of service, I think we're getting, it's the perennial conflict. Do we give the people what they want? Or do we give the people what they need? Or do we give the people what we think they need? Or do we give the people what they think they need? And that's been the eternal conundrum all the way through. But when you're talking about dollars and cents, basically the metrics are going to lead the way for us here. If that answers your question in a really convoluted way. Okay.
Was there any other questions from the room? Yeah.
Good evening. Mahendra Singh Taneja, Director of Diversity Outreach, Suffolk County. A lot of new immigrant groups moving into Long Island, different cultures, religions, countries. Now, has that kind of made any difference in your approach to the journalism from a local level, or what you see in the near future? How is that going to impact journalism? Like Brown and all, we work very well together, and she has always been trying to cover different groups. So in overall journalism angle, has that, what is your opinion on that?
I mentioned that Joe and I were involved in this program with the New York Press Association a couple of years ago. We talked about understanding our communities better, and this is one of the aspects of this program was to really do the math and create the metrics that explored what your community is, how it is made up, how it has changed, with the belief that we will be surprised when the numbers come in to see how our communities may have changed, or how they may be, in fact, be different than what we, as editors, believe them to be. So when we started, to answer your question, we incorporated the notion of exploring about how our communities have changed ethnically and culturally. I have to say, out by us in the Hamptons, the culture has changed quite a bit, and I think, Joe, I think we've done a fairly good job of trying to reflect on those changes. And I think that they will do more of that. But this is something that we started looking at a couple of years ago, and using the math and the metrics to help us to understand what our community was. If that answers your question.
And if we're not adapting to the community, then we're not telling the story of Long Island. because as it continues to get diverse in different ways, not only do the staffs at the news organizations have to be diverse to understand the communities and to be able to tell those stories and inform internally at the news organizations, they need to be able to tell it for the sake of the growing audience, that they could, mirror that, reflect that, shape that with them, and that's the most, that's the most broad scope of thinking about how everybody's perspective should be met inside the org and in the news and storytelling that's done.
Can I just one more line to add? So culturally and ethnically, yes, all those things, but now also the next step in journalism should really, in my opinion, to focus is that what all contributions from economic point of view, from other angle market point of view, whatever way, how can they help in growing the economy, growing the society, growing, what we were talking about, making sure that our youngsters, our younger generation stays here. That also should be putting a focus on. When they come here, they work hard, they succeed, and how can those kind of their values and their hard work also be incorporated into the journalism.
A couple things. First, we knew back in the 1980s that Long Island was changing, and it's funny, it's not funny, but it's fascinating to me that what was predicted by demographers in the 80s is absolutely 100% correct. We knew that the Latino population would grow. We knew that the largest change in population by percentage would be Asian, and that has come to pass. We knew that immigrants were going to be the largest part of the population. If you look at our census numbers, the only way Long Island grew was through these groups. And what I always say is there was a time when I first came to Newsday when communities of color, immigrants would put a demand on us that we pay attention to them. And to me, that was like the kumbaya period. Let's hold hands, kumbaya. Well, we're past that now as far as I'm concerned. We're if the survival of these institutions are gonna rest on customers, and the customer base has changed and continues to change very, very rapidly. So we've gone past kumbaya to a business imperative of not just, covering holidays or festivals or parades, but really, as I say, covering this community of communities in all ways. High taxes, guess he pays high taxes just like anybody else does. I don't think we've gotten to the point where we think like that, although the numbers tell us that it's well past the time that we did. So the question again, and you're asking what we're doing, I think again, it's a challenge to our institutions. And I know Newsday is in fact working on this and has been. How do we connect with all of our customers? And how do we connect especially with the fastest growing groups of our, groups. There are a lot of different people out there right now. And that's part of the challenge that we have to face. And if we don't face it, we're going to begin to, our financial future depends on us doing this, not just doing it better, but doing it well.
Can I ask you editors out there, to what degree do you get people of color, I was going to say minority, but a lot of them is not minority any longer, candidates in to come to apply for work, for jobs? Any of you editors out there want to respond? There's got to be an editor or two out there.
The last 4 hires in the last 4 years are all non-white, non-male applicants.
That's what you've been hiring?
The last 4 candidates in the last 4 years have all been non-white, non-male candidates.
Okay.
Do you find it helps?
Of course.
How?
Actually, in a number of ways, because I work for public media, I work for an NPR member station, and our audiences are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly over the age of 60 and 65. And so and I'm very passionate about public media as a nonprofit mechanism for telling stories. And if my section of this industry has any longevity, then we need to better represent the communities that we cover.
If I may, just to piggyback on something Bryan talked about, in the heady days before COVID, when we actually had more resources, we were, things have changed significantly since COVID, but when we had some resources, one of the things to come out of our project was, for a time, we had in our newsroom a reporter whose beat was undercovered parts of the community. Go find the people in our community who are not being covered adequately. And that was actually a beat, and it generated stories, and it wasn't just it was telling the good stories along with the bad stories, but it was just, what are the parts of the community that we aren't telling those stories about? Go find them. And we had the luxury of that, and we actually had the luxury at that time of having a reporter who spoke Spanish, which helped us in that community, but we also have a Native American community. And we had never, I've been an editor there for more than 20 years now. But before that, had never covered that community like it was part of our coverage area. It was a part, and that was something that was really important to me to fix when I got on board, and it's about telling the good and the bad stories. And you take some grief when you tell the bad stories, but when you tell enough of the good stories too, you find out that they become part of your community. They were part of your community. And that's the point, is finding the people that aren't getting those voices. And I think Jamie's absolutely right. If we're not telling those stories, we're not doing our job.
See, and I have as I said, I have a unique perspective on this, because basically I've been a minority affairs reporter for almost 40 years. Right, Bohinder? I've known you for 1,001 years. And it's interesting because I've actually had to I'm now in like my third generation of sources, like on the res and other places. And a lot of people I started out with have buildings named after them, which probably tells me it's time to retire. But it is kind of a fascinating thing to see. And as I say, it's just, as an outsider coming in and watching this evolve over 4 decades, you see clearly what's there, and you also see very clearly the gap that we have no choice now other than to your points. Phil.
Great. Any last parting words before we end the evening? Last licks?
I'm just very disappointed that LI News Tonight folded, and the communications department folded its tent over at New York Institute of Technology.
Yeah, it's bad.
I was a news director over there in 1984-85, and John Miller helped start that program, and Ken Eckert continued it right into the 2000s, and a lot of journalists in New York City and here on Long Island came out of that program. And it's sad to see that no other college has taken on the assignment that once was in LI News Tonight. It was, for those of you who may not know what LI News Tonight was, it was a newsroom, a working newsroom, where they would have reporters go out and cover news with cameras and microphones, and covering actual real live news conferences and events, tragedies and protests and demonstrations, and they would cover it along with the journalists from New York City as well as from Long Island, News 12. And eventually they would learn the business by doing the business. And the program was broadcast every night live on, not live, but recorded and rebroadcast on Telecare Channel 29 on cable for many, many years, from 1983, 84 through last year, and it's sad to see that program gone. I'd like to see it, you know, Hofstra could really expand this program and do something with it here.
It has started to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
Scott Britton is running something called the Long Island Advocate, which
Yeah.
the principle is send student journalists out to cover Long Island.
Good.
Now, the part that doesn't exist yet is the major broadcast element.
Yeah.
But I think that's the 2.0 of this.
Well, we sat down with Telecare and with the bishop and the diocese, and they made their air time available, so we could use their 15 minutes from 7 o'clock to 7:15 every night. Before that, we actually had to make 7 tapes and have carriers bring them to each of the 7 cable companies around Long Island. Eventually, that became just one cable company, Cablevision. But it just, I would like to see that program reconstituted somehow on Long Island. Another sad thing is that Channel 21, which was once our television station, public television station here, once belonged to us. It doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to Channel 13 in New York City, and just rebroadcasts everything that they do on Channel 13 in the city. And they have no local staff that I can remember. I would like to see, I remember the very first election night I did here on Long Island was 1984 with a number of students from LI News Tonight and Channel 21, and Susan McGowan was my co-anchor, and we broadcast on Channel 21. Desmond Ryan was our political expert who analyzed everything, and that was the re-election of President Reagan. But never again did they have a situation like that. So I'd like to see that reconstituted somehow locally here. We've got the outlets to do it, and we certainly have the brains and the know-how to get it done. But I wish it would get done.
By the way, you guys did a hell of a job on election night.
Yeah, see
Really
that.
nice. Good job. It was a good
That
job.
should be heard more universally than it was.
They're talking about Hofstra Votes Live,
Yes.
Yeah.
which was an incredibly
Yeah.
produced broadcast. Professor Burke was involved, Scott was involved, a number of the full-time faculty, and hundreds of students helped produce a live broadcast for Hofstra TV. I agree. I think it needs more universal love outside of the walls of the school.
Yeah.
And obviously it's on social media and you can see it on YouTube, but there's the pieces to put something bigger together. Yeah, Hofstra Votes Live. Parting words from you two? Anything left to say?
Is this building named after the New York News journalist or the developer?
It's probably the developer.
Developer.
Yeah. Yeah.
That brother.
It's not Jimmy.
Not our Jimmy.
Jimmy's cousin.
No, the only thing I would say is for those of you who are editors or those who are in the business, I think our business, it's changed, it's always evolving, but I think at the bottom line, the more time you spend in the street, the more time you go out, and think of it as your own variation of revenge journalism. I think the better off we'll all be. I think that people do respond to that. I know that people do respond to that because the metrics tell you. So there's no guesswork. Take it out of there. So that's what I would do. I think that this is, people think that you have to take a side. I think you don't have to. I think what you have to do is talk to all sides. Even when they don't want to talk to you, you still go and you physically present yourself and you talk to all sides. Yeah, and that's it for me.
That's it. Well,